All right. Welcome to the second lecture for fashion motivation. And today we're talking about consumer influences. So, I'll give an overview of cultural influence on consumer behavior, and then we'll talk about the creation and diffusion of consumer culture. So, when you think about cultural influences on consumer behavior, we're thinking about culture as sort of, the shared meanings, rituals, norms, traditions amongst members of any given organization or society. So, fashion consumer choices, have to be understood within the cultural context in which they are made. Culture is the lens through which people view these products that they're purchasing. If we ignore the fact that culture has this influence, we're not really getting that full picture. And so I gave you some examples. It's a cultural norm that around the holidays, people will buy their loved ones gifts. Another cultural norm in the U.S. Is that, a bride will wear white to her wedding. And then other cultural norms relate to, holidays, gift giving, and things like that. So some Valentine's Day roses and chocolates, is another example of a purchase, made within a ritual in the United States. We don't really appreciate the power of culture on consumer behavior until perhaps we encounter a different culture or someone from a different culture and we learn something that is counter to our own lived experiences. We also don't always take into account, that the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the way we talk to one another, those things can be very different within other cultures. Very important to keep in mind if you're going into an occupation where the reach is global, such as fashion. There are many different cultures and subcultures within the United States. And having that sensitivity and awareness of cultural difference is really important for brand managers to understand as brands expand into different countries, or even branding within different segments of the United States could be different based on cultural norms. So, one of the things to keep in mind as people move around from one part of the world to another, they bring with them their culture into the place that they move to. And while some folks will really keep the traditions of their culture and their clothing alive, others might assimilate into standards in the U.S. or that part of the country. So, it's kind of interesting that also some groups will decide to really only save their cultural dress for holidays or special occasions, while others will wear it every day no matter where they live. So kind of something interesting to think about and putting fashion into cultural context. So a consumer's culture really does determine the priorities that they place in different activities and products. So, I have some images here, to think about, a traditional Indian wedding, or, how women who, want to follow the rules of their religion may have to cover themselves, and, how they can still participate in sport while honoring that religious tradition. And then also thinking about, globally, like uniforms and clothing that people wear to certain spaces. So we have these school uniforms to help showcase that. A product that provides a benefit to members of a certain culture will have a better chance of gaining acceptance. And an example of this, American culture being obsessed with the idea of a fit and trim body really hit its peak in the mid-1970s and really hasn't gone that down since. Customers really valued this goal. There was a focus on mobility, wealth, self, and that resulted in products that related to exercise or low calories to do really well on the market. So if as long as a culture values, a certain new introduction of products, they'll have a better chance of gaining acceptance in the market. So here is your first message board of this week. I want you to think about consumer values and how they impact choices that consumers make. So I want to use the beauty industry. Hopefully you have some familiarity. If not, you can easily, use Google and other resources to help you answer these message boards. But I want you to think about some of the product's characteristics and how they can be important to consumers based on things that the consumer themselves values. So, in terms of cosmetics, what would someone who is vegan look for within their choice of cosmetics? There could be quite a few things. Maybe you could outline just one or two. What would someone who's interested in sustainability look for in their cosmetics, potentially even within their cosmetics packaging? What are some other qualities that beauty consumers might look for within certain products? So think about some of the goals and objectives of beauty products. What might be some of the characteristics or qualities that a consumer would look for to gain out of their product? So you can either pause this video and answer this message board now, or wait till the end and answer at that time. Okay, so our culture makes meaning between different times and categories. And fashion provides us a system that helps to visually signify these categories within society. So it's common to find a dominant aspect of culture at any point in time related within the marketing and design of products that we see. Cultural values, environmentalism, or different political beliefs can determine the kinds of products likely to be accepted by consumers at any point in time. So, just to kind of see historically some clothing influenced by political figures and celebrities, we have Jackie O during her time, in the limelight. Her famous hat, her pillbox style hat, was very popular. People admired her taste and her style and wanted to emulate it. We have Madonna, who's often a trendsetter in many different decades, but, was really setting some trends for clubwear and different kinds of really fashion-forward clothing through her style. And then sometimes movies can also be those catalysts for a certain style of clothing. So, that style of sweatshirt, was very popular when Flashdance was out. Sometimes cultural events can affect fashion as well. And so designers like Pierre Cardin and Rudy Greenrich, had these futuristic space-inspired outfits back in the 60s. And, that was at a time where the U.S. was sending satellites up, and there was a lot with space exploration. And so that can really influence sometimes these current events and can have an influence within fashion. After 9/11, patriotic clothing and accessories were very popular. After experiencing the trauma of 9/11, consumers were wanting to rally around something, and the American flag was one of those items that really did inspire fashion at the times following 9/11. Sometimes sporting events can be cultural examples of influences on fashion. The women's soccer team, very successful when, after that, young girls were buying their jerseys and, wanting to emulate them. Sometimes during other sporting events like the X Games, what the participants wear is noticed and emulated by fans of that sport. So, thinking about culture, it is constantly changing, evolving the old with the new. Members within a society and culture may have a similar worldview, not always, may. And they may also share the same moral and aesthetic principles. And again, that's a may, that is not a, must. There are several ways to describe the different components of culture. So we could look at the ecology, the way in which a system is adapted to its habitat. So, for example, Japan, which is known for being a very crowded country with lots of people, has found a way to efficiently utilize space in terms of city planning and, architecture. So, that is one of the ways to think about a component of culture. There's also social structures, the way in which orderly life is organized and maintained. And a lot of TV shows and movies, if you think about them, they focus on social structure. And then another aspect of culture is the ideology, the mental characteristics of people and how they relate to their environment and their social groups. So those are just some things to think about in terms of the aspects of culture. There's also material culture, which includes handmade materials, and oftentimes, thinking about societies in the past, these are items that can often be found in museums. They're things that were studied to understand how people lived at the time. And then there's also non-material culture, and this is more of the thoughts, feelings, behaviors that are shared within a group. This could be religion, this could be different standards that society upheld people to, expectations of what is right and wrong in society. Those are the things that can make up a non-material culture. Now, both of these are often intertwined because the beliefs that people have are often embedded within their material things. So just something to think about how, again, our, a culture's behaviors, thoughts, feelings can really have an impact on the goods, the garments, the, items in the lives of people within a culture. So this is just to get you thinking. You don't have to answer this on message boards. You don't have to answer this, in any written form. But I just wanted to give you some examples of how values and beliefs can be embedded within garments. So, look at this picture. What kinds of values and beliefs in our society do you think of when you think of graduation cap and gown? What kinds of values and beliefs are part of our society that are embedded within, a bride's gown, her bouquet? What values and beliefs are embedded in the garments that a religious leader wears? What do you think of when you see a person in religious garment? What are the values and beliefs embedded within military uniforms? What do you think of when you see someone wearing a military uniform? What does our culture generally think of with these uniforms? And what do you think of when you see someone wearing medical professional clothing? What values are embedded within the clothing that doctors and nurses wear? Even within both of those kinds of garments, is there a hierarchy to what a doctor wears versus what a nurse wears? How does our society view these medical employees? And then what values or beliefs are embedded when someone wears their favorite sports team's jersey? What does that mean to people who see this, and then those are teams that they don't like? What does it mean to people who see these sports jerseys and these are teams that they do like? What kind of values and beliefs are embedded within non-players wearing professional sports jerseys? And cowboy boots as a garment. What values or beliefs are embedded into this accessory? What does this make you think of culturally? Okay, so while all cultures are different, There are four main things that can account for the differences within cultures. Power distance, the way in which interpersonal relationships form, and how power differences are perceived. So, for example, in Japan, there's often a very strict hierarchy, where in the US, we're a more informal society in general. Uncertainty avoidances, the way people feel threatened by ambiguous situations and have beliefs to help them avoid this uncertainty. So religion is a huge uncertainty avoidance. Things that we worry about that are out of our control, how to deal with them. Oftentimes for many folks, religion plays a role in that. The way that gender is defined within a culture, which behaviors, clothings, actions are considered more towards the masculine side, which behaviors, clothing, actions are more considered towards the feminine side. Sort of if we're looking at that dichotomy, a lot of times different cultures will assess whether something is more masculine or feminine. And then individualism. Is the society more shared, more collectivist with a focus on the group? Or is it more individual with a focus on the self? So those are four main things that you might find in different cultures. And how that can relate to fashion and branding is, you don't want to, if you're going to use advertising, I'll use individualism as an example. If you were going to advertise an exercise bike, you might show how, in the US, you might show that how it can help one person reach their fitness goals and make them stronger. Where if you were going to focus an ad on for an exercise bike, in a more collectivist society, you might focus the ad on it, helps you contribute more because you're stronger, you're able to do more tasks in your community. Maybe you're helping train and mentor others to use this fitness equipment because you've become so good at it. So, kind of thinking about your audience, these are just important aspects of culture to keep in mind. Two terms, I want you to be aware of, and if you are taking anthropology or sociology classes, I'm sure you've, used these terms. Values. So these are just general standards of what's considered good and bad in a society. And norms are the rules that dictate what is right and wrong or acceptable and unacceptable. There are two types of norms. There's enacted norms, which are explicitly enacted on. So we all know when we pull up to the stoplight, green means go, red means stop, right? And then there are crescent norms, and these are embedded within culture and only discovered through interactions with people in the culture. So for example, I don't actually know a lot about this, but, if you're someone who's practicing karate, you probably are very familiar with the belt colors and what each belt means and stands for. Where me as an outsider, I really don't know much about the belts, except that, I think black is supposed to be, the best black belt. So. And I could even be wrong. So, that's just something to kind of think about, is that there can be two types of norms. A few more words to kind of help you kind of, have some language to use around culture. Customs, those are passed down from generation to generation, and they're very slow to change. So for example, an example of a custom is the white wedding dress in the US. Mores, these are customs with strong moral overtones. So for example, we definitely don't want to be nude in public because that has a moral overtone of a very inappropriate thing. And then there are conventions. These are norms regarding everyday life, and an example of a convention within fashion is that the side the buttons are on for men's and women's blouses and shirts are different. So is there, a true reason for this? Well, a lot of fashion scholars say that, women used to be dressed by attendants and that's why. But in today's day and age, is there still a true reason for this? No, but it is a convention that still stands. Myths are also very important within culture. A myth is a story containing symbolic elements that express a shared emotion and idea of a culture. For example, in fashion, the myth of how Nike was started was that the running coach who was trying to get runners to run faster used a waffle iron to make a rubber sole for the shoe so that the runner could have more traction and get more, farther and faster, right? So, that's sort of their origin story, their myth, and even in the Nike headquarters, they have the waffle iron on display that was used. So myth can be very important when creating culture and when in existing culture. Myths serve four functions within a culture. They can focus on the metaphysical, so the origin, the starting story of the culture. They could focus on the cosmos, how we're one and within the universe. They can be more on the sociological side, thinking about groups and maintaining social order. And they can also be on the psychological side about how one should behave and act within a culture. So rituals are also very important to think about when we think about culture. So a ritual is a set of behaviors and symbols that occur and are repeated and, very much, something that a culture would consider a norm to partake in these rituals too, right? So, for example, some rituals within that relate to clothing and accessories, wearing or even shopping for that prom dress, is a ritual in U.S. culture. Getting that tuxedo rented for a prom. Wearing a gown at graduation to celebrate finishing an academic accomplishment. Wearing a gown at a wedding. Now, while yes, there are some very fabulous pantsuits and things that break that traditional norm, it still is a common ritual within the United States, within U.S. culture. When a young child is baptized and going through that religious ritual, they are wearing a gown, usually white. When a person wants to join a Greek life organization, for example, a sorority, they often are given a pin to be symbolic of going through the ritual of joining the sorority. And also when folks are getting married. It's quite common part of the ritual of taking your courtship to the next level and in getting ready to be married by presenting your future spouse with an engagement ring. So, these are just some rituals, and, even with the prom dresses and graduation gowns, these sometimes also present that shift from being seen as a young adult to an adult, or being seen, you've now reached a closer, more mature part of your life. So, just kind of thinking about how rituals can impact dress and different things like that. Now, brands can also have rituals. And in the research related to consumer behavior, brand rituals are actually very positive because they really do impact brand loyalty and are seen as a way to increase brand attractiveness. So one of the brand rituals that, I have is I read my daily e-blast every morning when they come into my inbox. And so, that could be a ritual connected to a brand. Also, for example, Corona, putting the lime in the Corona is almost, the only way to drink it, right? In the mind of brand rituals. And also the way that people eat Oreos, if they separate them, dip them in milk, there's a whole ritual to that. So you may not agree with all, a brand's rituals, but just, it's something you're probably aware of. And definitely it's something that can increase a positive interaction with the brand. Another type of ritual is gift-giving rituals. And so a lot of times how this relates to products is there are certain products that are very acceptable to give for certain occasions. And clothing as gifts presents a challenge because it's a very individual choice, the clothing that we wear. And there's meaning that we have in our clothing. So if someone is purchasing clothing for you, you would imagine that they would know you very well to be able to understand, what style, color, fit, fashions you would be interested in. But it can be so difficult. And so I'd love to hear some of your experiences with getting clothing as gifts. So here is our next message board activity. I want you to maybe just reflect for a few minutes about different clothes you've received in the past. Was there a clothing gift that you loved? Was there a clothing gift that you disliked? If you've got examples for both, please share. For each of those, who gave you those gifts and what were the occasions? And then did you ever tell the gift giver your true feelings about the gift, whether you liked it or didn't like it, and why or why not? So I'd love for you to either pause here and go and answer that, or just answer that after you're done viewing the video. Moving on to rites of passage. Rites of passages are part of part of every culture. They mark a change in social status, and they are occurring as part of the consumer's life cycle, potentially, where others are more individual. So examples of things like a Sweet 16 would be potentially or quinceanera would be part of a consumer's life cycle. Other things like a retirement party, or even more kind of, we see this where when someone becomes single again, their friends take them out, they might have a little party. These are some rites of passage that a consumer might go through. And so there's 3 phases when thinking about a rite of passage. There's the separation from the old life, the old self. There's the in-between part, where the consumer is, now adapting to the new responsibilities or new parts of their life now that they've gone through this rite of passage. And then there's the afterthought, of now they are in that rite of passage, they are now on the other side. So some other rites of passage could include sorority and fraternity pledges, religious vows, wedding vows, and even funerals. So different rites of passages. And, one of the things to think about with this is that there are different ways that consumers will dress and clothing needs that they will have depending on some of these rites of passages. So in today's day and age, it's really hard to be completely new. So many trends come from a fusion of different cultures to make a new concept. A big thing to keep in mind, as you are fusing different cultures or different elements from different cultures, you must have cultural sensitivity. And so an example of something that didn't necessarily keep cultural sensitivity in mind is in January of 2019, Nike Air, and they have done this, Nike has made some mistakes, but this is one of the more recent ones. Their sole of their shoe for the Nike Air was too close to the calligraphy for the Arabic word for Allah, meaning God. And because it was on the sole of the shoe, which is where someone steps, it was viewed as very disrespectful because it could, be in the dirt and get really filthy. So, while you are, going into fashion and going to be designing or developing or merchandising, whatever career path you want to go into, keep in mind different cultures, and you always want to show your product to a lot of different people to ensure that you're, being mindful of cultural sensitivity and cultural issues. So in terms of thinking about strategies that companies and corporations use, I wanted to go over two types of strategies, your standard strategy and your localized strategy. So a standardized strategy in terms of a brand is that that cultures around the world are very homogenized, that the same approach will work throughout the world. So examples of companies that do that have the standardized strategy, are Gap and Starbucks. Now, yes, things like sizing for Gap, maybe some slight color changes, that could happen. But, generally, if you're, traveling around the world and you see a Gap and you go in, it's going to look familiar, right? And same for Starbucks. There might be different menu items at different Starbucks around the world, but if you go into a Starbucks, you're going to be mostly familiar, right? Except I remember when I was in Ireland a few years ago, I was like, oh yeah, the Starbucks here serves alcohol. That's really weird, right? But everything else was the same, right? And then there is a localized strategy. So this is where a brand is going to take a multinational strategy and focus on variations within a culture. So IKEA actually is a really good example of that. The IKEA furniture that they sell in China is going to be very different than the IKEA furniture they sell in Australia. And they're really, what they're doing is they're trying to get into the mindset of their local consumer and what that local consumer needs in that area. So, in addition, this can also be interesting to think about in terms of advertising. So in some countries, advertising is completely government controlled. For example, in Germany, you are only going to see ads with purely factual information about the products. This computer can, go this fast. It can host all these programs. It is a great computer. But they'll probably can't even say that, right? They can just say the facts. But, when you watch an Apple commercial in the US, I don't even know what the computer can do. I just know that it looks great and there's great music playing in the background, right? So very different thing to think about in terms of advertising in different countries. In the UK and Japan, ads are seen as entertainment. If it doesn't make you laugh or doesn't make you think, is it a success? Probably not, right? So kind of thinking about some of those differences as you're, going into the fashion industry and working on different branding strategies, you need to be aware of local customs. Oops, I got just focused on that. So if your brand is moving into another country, it is so important that you research the customs and cultures or hire people from within those customs and cultures to help make sure that your marketing is on point. For example, there's things that are just, small cultural insights that you wouldn't know unless you were from that culture. So for example, the number 4 is a very superstitious number in Japan. So while in the US, we're very used to buying plates or other home goods in sets of 4. In Japan, you would want to sell it in a set of 5 to not, rile anybody with that superstition. And then depending on the culture, reference to risque behavior or bodily functions may or may not be permitted. And language barriers can also be an issue. They're in one of the consumer motivation books that I used to build this lecture. They give an example of a dry cleaner who put on their sign, drop your pants here for best results. Not a good translation. So, just kind of thinking about language potentially as an issue as well. When it comes to global brands, you can break consumers into these different segments and sort of thinking about consumers' relationships with goods that are available globally. So there are what we would call global citizens, and these are consumers who are concerned that companies are maintaining high ethical standards and responsibility. We have global dreamers who see brands that are global as being of high quality. Whether or not that's the case, that is just how the consumer perceives a global brand. We have anti-globals. Those are consumers who really prefer to buy locally. And then we have global agnostics. Those are consumers that don't base their purchase on the fact that brands are global or local. They're sort of impartial in that way too. So consumers are often faced with choices, about how to dress themselves, how to maintain their image, and they have a lot of choices. So in a recent Psychology Today article, research showed that if you're surrounded by a lot of options, you typically end up less satisfied with your final decision than if you'd been given fewer options in the first place. So, that's a really interesting thing to think about. Because, you can very easily walk into Target, and if you just needed to buy a V-neck t-shirt, there's probably like 3 or 4 different racks that just have V-neck t-shirts, right? So, if you're thinking about it, you probably have 40 choices. Where, this based off the Psychology Today ad, consumers are more satisfied if they had only had 4 choices in the first place. So it's just an interesting study, something to keep in mind as we have so many things at our fingertips with Amazon and other online shopping that we really have, the sky's the limit to what kind of clothing we have access to. Some characteristics of a postmodern society, or fashion within a postmodern society, is typically fashion consumers have an increased global awareness. There's a blending of traditions. There's breaking of gender roles. People can feel comfortable wearing, clothing that might traditionally have been associated with the gender different than theirs, or they're wearing clothing that is gender neutral. A lot of times, because there is nothing new, folks really revert to retro looks. And subcultures fusing different ideas to create newness. So those are some characteristics of fashion within our postmodern society. Now switching gears to sort of the creation of culture. It's common for our mainstream culture to modify symbols identified with subcultures so that they can present these to a larger audience to have more acceptance in mass market. These products undergo a process of cooptation in which their meanings are transformed by the outsiders, by the people who are, not basically knocking off their original ideas. So, in the case of hip-hop music, the original content focused on the struggles of young African Americans, and that message, some argue was lost as hip-hop style emerged as mainstream entertainment and fashion. How cultural items are produced. We can look at the cultural production process. And so this is where we have a cycle of, this process it just continues. It's cyclical. But individuals and organizations who are responsible for creating marketing are part of this cultural production system. So fashion, we can argue, is part of this cultural production system because we're creating new messages and new products within culture. So creative subsystems responsible for generating new symbols or products, combined with managerial subsystems, which are responsible for selecting, making, mass producing, and managing the distribution of these new symbols or products, are part of the cultural production system. And that is filtered down to communication subsystems, and that is responsible for giving meaning to new products and communicating these symbolic attributes to the consumer. So this is pretty heavy stuff, more theoretical based, but basically it shows that, culture can be produced by many different people, but often marketers and people who are creatives, have that power to create new cultural symbols, new fashions, and then it will go through and be communicated to the consumer. So think about marketing, advertising. And then there are cultural gatekeepers. These are the people who will either adopt the culture or reject it. And there are both formal gatekeepers, people who have a very formal voice. And then there are informal gatekeepers, people who maybe are, using social media or are your friends, your family, and how they respond to new fashions, new cultural items, will impact how you respond to them as a consumer. And this cycle just goes over and over and over again. So very theoretical, just something to think about, because how new cultural products and fashions are produced and accepted into society is something that is studied and is part of thinking about consumer behavior. So a lot of times, choices of what is popular or what is, presented to us in the medium, it really does reflect our society and our culture. And can often reflect even deeper societal trends. So for example, environmentalism is a great example. A lot of folks are focusing on sustainability and using sustainable materials. And so, that is something that has become reflected within fashion. Fashion often begins as a unique statement by a small group and then spreads to others as they become increasingly aware of it. Sometimes fashion can originate from designers, but also from ordinary people who modify their clothes. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind with, where, new fashions originate from. Most fashions eventually wear out because people are constantly seeking for new ways to express themselves. So our next message board is thinking about consumers as trendsetters. So people will modify their clothing to make their own fashion statements. What are some examples you can think of where people have modified fashion items? What are some fashion items that you can think of that people have adopted outside of their normal use? Can you think of any do-it-yourself designs people tend to do? So for example, when I was young, people used to decorate their school backpacks with whiteout. So a very do-it-yourself type of thing, but was adopted by a lot of users. So I want you to go, again, you can either pause here and go and do that message board now, or you can, push through and do after. If we think about components that make up the cultural production system, like I was showing you on that chart, going into this theory a little bit deeper, the creative subsystem is responsible for new symbols and products, so that could be the designer. The managerial subsystem mass produces, manages, and distributes the new symbols. In fashion, that could be a licensing company. Communication subsystem, gives meaning to new products, provides symbolic attributes for consumers. That could be an ad agency. So maybe, hopefully, this gives that theoretical image a little bit more substance, having those examples for what that could look like within the fashion industry. Cultural gatekeepers within the fashion industry are magazines, social media influencers, trade publications, fashion shows, trade shows. There can be many different cultural gatekeepers. Women's Wear Daily is a great example of one. So another thing to think about with culture is that there can be high culture and low culture. If you've heard those terms before, high culture is usually considered art, and pop culture is usually considered low culture. But oftentimes in fashion, we can see those things blended. Keith Haring and Andy Warhol inspired sneakers, and Salvador Dali inspired clothing by Schiaparelli. We can see sort of a blend between high and low culture in fashion. One thing to be conscious of in fashion and in entertainment is reality engineering. So product placement is an example of how reality is engineered, because perhaps that product wouldn't have appeared in the filming of a television show or a movie if it hadn't been placed there by marketers. Sometimes shows will use similar sounding products instead of the real thing. Riverdale does this all the time. For example, Vanity Fair, as a magazine that Veronica mentions. So, is it a Vanity Fair? The use of scents in the retail environment. Abercrombie is really big on that, releasing a signature scent into the store while customers are shopping. Distressed clothing is another example of how fashion can engineer reality. The tears in the jeans weren't there because someone actually tripped and fell. They were put there by machines. And then branded entertainment. So when we have, something that is on television and it's actually connected to a brand. I think about a show I used to watch that was The Biggest Loser, and how they often had Planet Fitness showcased in within their show. So it was kind of deeper than product placement. It was a huge part of the show and part of the entertainment. So innovation is very important in fashion. It can often take place in form of new clothing style, a new manufacturing technique, or a new way of sharing a service. In the fashion industry, consumers are often offered innovation on an ongoing basis. Think about footwear. Footwear is a place where a lot of technology and a lot of innovation happens. Sometimes innovation is at the hands of young people who maybe combine different fashion items to make up their own new look. And we think back to trickle-up theory. If an innovation is successful, it spreads throughout the population, first by a few, until more and more consumers adopt it. And so there's actually theory of innovation diffusion that seeks to explain why and how and at what rate new designs and technologies spread throughout a culture. So a theorist and sociologist, Everett Rogers, argues that diffusion is a process by which an innovation is communicated to different participants in a society. And this is sort of how we can have a visual to think about diffusion of culture. So at the beginning, we have innovators. These are people who are more risk takers, willing to try things early on. Then we move to our early adopters, people who are still pretty up near the front of adopting a trend, but not right at the beginning. Then we have at the tip of the curve the early majority. This is, where we've really reached, this is the largest segment of the population we've reached so far, the 34%. And then as the trend sort of has been distributed over the market, we have the late majority who come in, and again, that percentage is pretty similar to the early majority. And then at the end, we have the last to adopt, the laggards, who are really coming in at the very end of the trend or the innovation. Some things that are needed for successful adoption of a trend, and this was identified by Rogers, was compatibility. It has to be something that fits the consumer's lifestyle. Trialability. The consumer needs the option to experiment before committing. And I think if you've been watching, you get the ads for Purple, the mattress, you can kind of see that being something that's part of their marketing strategy and adoption strategies. You get 100 nights to try it. Complexity. It shouldn't be hard to use or understand. It should be very straightforward. I should get it. Observability. The more I can see it, the more I see it throughout my society, the more it is likely to spread. And then it needs to have a relative advantage, a benefit that other products do not offer at the time. So those really do help a new product or service become more adoptable. There are also 5 stages that a consumer goes through when adopting innovations. There's the knowledge stage, persuasion, they start to form their opinion. The decision, that's where they either decide to go with it or reject it. Implementation, that's where, if they've adopted, they're using the product. And then confirmation. This is where, maybe they're seeking reinforcement from other users, or they are, very satisfied with the product or not, and then making decisions going forward. So in terms of innovation, I just want you to reflect on a few case studies that I have in terms of fashion. I want you to think about these different things in terms of, are these things that you have adopted or would adopt? Why or why not? So clothing rental has become very popular. So I want you to just take a few seconds to think if you would use it or you have used it. What were your thoughts about it? Is it something you would recommend to others? Where did you fall in terms of your adoption of this? Were you very early? Did you come in at the middle? Just want you to kind of reflect on clothing rental as a service within the fashion industry and how it is viewed by yourself and maybe members of your social circle. The next thing I want you to think about is Warby Parker, the glasses. In case you don't know about them, they are mail order glasses where you can order them online, and now even on their app, try them on your face. So, how comfortable would you feel using this service? Even if you're not someone who wears glasses, if your doctor suddenly told you you had to, how would you feel about that? And, what do you think of where, this fits into innovation? How innovative is this product or service? And lastly, Rothy's washable shoes, right? Made out of recyclable materials. Where do you think this fits on innovation? How is this something that people are responding to in your social circle? How are you responding to it? Do you feel that this is something that is going to last? Where do you think it kind of fits on that innovation scale? Just want you to kind of think about that. All right, so that ends our second week's lecture. If you have any questions about any of the things we covered, I do cover a lot in this week because it's very theoretical. I'm pulling from consumer motivation textbooks, so please feel free to let me know if anything was unclear or you would like additional resources about any of the topics covered. I kind of jump around a lot, so if you need to rewatch certain parts, please do. But this is definitely, in terms of thinking of consumer behavior and how consumers interact with ads and how important marketing, considering culture within marketing, those are some of the key takeaways that I want you to take away with you this week. So I look forward to, next class. Thank you.